All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming out. This is a fantastic crowd. It'd be nice if this many people showed up for administrative law on occasion, but that's whatever, we go with what we have. I realize our guest is a much bigger draw. So I want to just introduce myself first. My name is Amr Khode. I'm an associate prof here at the Faculty of Law. I just want to introduce, this is the first of many speaking events we'll have at the Faculty of Law. I'm the chair of this Distinguished Visitors Committee. The series invites, as we have today, a number of distinguished individuals, scholars, practitioners, journalists, and other people who can contribute to our knowledge about various facets about the law. And Professor Hathaway is our first speaker this semester. Now, I just want to because it's the first talk, I want to just quickly introduce members of the committee. As I said, I chair it, but I'm also on the committee with Dr. Deloyd Guth, who's sitting here with us, Associate Dean Dr. Bruce Curran back there, Dr. Virginia Torrey, who couldn't make it here today, unfortunately, and our student representative, Ali Derwin, who's sitting by with us. And so we put together, I think, a great list for this year, and we hope you come out. So let me first now take a moment to introduce our speaker, who really needs no introduction, but I will anyway, because he really deserves it. So Professor James E. Hathaway, he is the James E. and Sarah A. Degan Professor of Law. That's a huge title. Can I just say how often I
gave a lot of money. What can I say?
Okay, fine. At the University of Michigan's Faculty of Law, he is a leading authority in the area of international refugee law. He's consistently cited by numerous legal scholars, but also common law courts across the world, including by our Supreme Court of Canada, the Federal Court of Appeal, and Federal Court. Professor Hathaway is also, in addition to being a professor of law, is the director of the Michigan Law's Program in Refugee and Asylum Law, and distinguished visiting professor of international refugee law at the University of Amsterdam. He is, however, no stranger to Canada. Before joining his current law faculty in 1998, he was a professor of law and associate dean at Osgoode Hall Law School, and has been appointed as a visiting professor at numerous universities across the world, including in Cairo, California, San Francisco, Stanford, Toronto, and Tokyo. He currently provides training on refugee law to academics, non-academics, non-governmental associations, and official audiences around the world, and of course, this body here. His publications are numerous and very well esteemed. Just to give you an example, he has published this fantastic book here, The Law of Refugee Status. This is the second edition, and he co-wrote this with Michelle Foster, as also an esteemed professor in Australia. This is the second edition. His first was sole author, but it was cited numerous times by, again, many courts and scholars. He has over 80 public articles as well, in addition to the books he has written. He also serves on several editorial boards, including the Journal of Refugee Studies, the Immigration and Nationality Law Reports. Each year, Professor Hathaway convenes a colloquium on specific issues concerning international refugee law. The colloquium typically studies a particular facet of refugee law, and then they produce a series of guidelines that are published. And they're, again, of incredible value to many of us writing on various issues. So today, he'll be speaking on the title is The False Panacea of Thin Protection: Why We Need a Bold Plan to Save Refugee Protection. So Professor Hathaway is going to speak for about 45 minutes or so. We're going to follow that up with a Q&A session. And then after that, we're going to have a brief announcement from our local Immigration Law Students Association here at Robson Hall, the Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers, our Robson Hall unit. And they'll make a quick announcement about an event that's going to be taking place tomorrow with Professor Hathaway. So that intro is being done. I'd like you all to join me in welcoming Professor James Hathaway.
Well, thank you, Amar. You realize as you get older, the introduction gets longer. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for hosting me, and Shauna Labman, Dean Jonathan Blackbranch, all of you for the hospitality that you've shown and inviting me, I will say, home to Canada. I am a Western Canadian, born a couple of provinces to the west, and I'm always delighted to have the chance to come back, despite the weather. You gave me a little break between the thunderstorms and the cold, I think, so I just like dip in, dip out quickly. So today, the plan, I know a lot of you are not steeped in what is happening in the global refugee system. And I need to immerse you in that in order to discuss with you where the system is headed and why I think the direction it's headed is wrong. So for those of you who really do know a lot about refugees, I apologize for the first 5 or 10 minutes, because for those who may think only in Canadian terms, for example, about the refugee situation, it's very easy to miss the fact that the global refugee system, based on the UN Refugee Convention of 1951, we've got 168 countries, including Canada, that are a part of that regime. That global regime is in fundamental meltdown right now. It is in a state of abject crisis. So what I want to suggest to you today is that there is a way out of that crisis that meets the needs of refugees and this is critical for lawyers, and of the states to which refugees flee. You have to do both. And that balance is what I'm going to suggest to you today is attainable but not on offer from the United Nations. So 2 points really. Number one, sticking with the status quo is not an option. And the second point I'd like to convince you of today is that the thin version of protection reform that the UN Refugee Agency, known as UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees, the thin version of reform that they are positing is simply not worth the time and trouble of doing. So let's begin with where we're at. You've all seen photos like this. Desperate refugees on tiny, overcrowded boats. This particular photo was from crossing the Mediterranean from North Africa headed to Europe. States really hate it when refugees arrive like this. It's messy, it's disorderly, it threatens their sense of security. And yet, refugees don't like this either. I mean, can you imagine being one of these people, right? But if there's no access to meaningful asylum close to home, even a 50-50 shot of surviving the Mediterranean looks pretty good compared to indentured servitude in Eritrea or ongoing bombing in Syria. That's a problem. When refugees actually do arrive, when they take up the offer of asylum that by international law we have made, they too often confront horrific conditions like this. States often overwhelmed by the arrival of refugees at often distant parts of their territory simply can't act quickly enough to ensure dignified conditions of reception, leaving refugees literally stuck in the mud, if not worse. Most refugees, if you talk with them, actually want to lead productive lives. They want to look after their own needs and those of their families. They want to make a contribution to the place where they arrive. But while the numbers are going down, it's still true that 40% of the refugees in the world live in horrible places like this. This is the Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya, where we are now into the third generation of refugees living behind barbed wire, with no ability to move, no ability to work, little ability to educate their children. So they're not only not looking after themselves, they're making no contribution whatever to their host communities. And to the extent we are increasingly able to get refugees out of camps, they tend to live in the hellhole of urban slums like this, which the UN claims as progress. But I have a hard time understanding that to be a better result. The developed world, rich countries like Canada, spend unconscionable sums of money to run the present refugee system. Rich countries spend more money to process the claims. Now, I know for lawyers this is a hard thing to wrap your head around. I'm going after us. Rich countries spend more money to process the claims of the 10% of the world's refugees who get to rich countries than is available to fund the protection of the 90% of refugees who are in the less developed world. OECD states, rich countries are now spending 25 billion Canadian dollars every year just to run their asylum systems that serve only 10% of the world's refugees. That is 3 times the total of what the UN has available to meet the needs of the other 90% of the world's refugees. You do not need to be a statistician to see that that's a wacky equation. Worst of all, there are today some 12 million refugees who have been waiting on average 20 years for a solution to their refugeehood with absolutely no prospect of a solution in sight. This is what the UN Refugee Agency calls the protracted refugee population. Of those 12 million who've been waiting an average of 20 years, only about 100,000 get resettled every year. Less than 1%, in other words, of the total, and nearly all of them to just 3 countries, of which Canada is one. So an absolutely critical part of the protection regime, finding new homes for refugees when going home is impossible, is being nearly completely ignored under the current system. So the bottom line, guys, is that the current refugee system is a complete mess. It is risky for countries and refugees. It's chaotic, it's debilitating, it's absurdly expensive, and it doesn't produce solutions for most refugees. If you were Price Waterhouse doing an audit of the system, you would shut it down tomorrow. It ought to file for bankruptcy on any logical approach. So what do we do? Is anybody going to fix this? Well, 3 years ago, the Secretary General of the United Nations announced that he was going to do that. He was going to launch a process that would finally fix this mess. Not renegotiate the convention, but renegotiate a mechanism by which to implement it more fairly and dependably. Yes, he did that because for the first time in history, large numbers of refugees had begun to literally wash up in the developed world, namely Syrians arriving in Europe. But for that fact, rich countries would probably have ignored this problem forever. For the first time in living memory, rich countries were facing a tiny bit of the specter that poor countries have faced forever. And that was what launched the ball in what has become called the Global Compact process that I'm going to talk more about in a moment. The problem is that what is being proposed is a very thin version of protection reform. It isn't worth pursuing, in my view. All it does is to literally paper over, to give a veneer of progress on top of substantive dysfunctionality. Rather than having the courage, for example, to propose a global and binding protocol, a subsidiary treaty, to actually remedy the operational deficiencies that I've just described in this regime, the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, is instead promoting a compact that is not remotely comprehensive. First of all, it will only apply, and I just love how somehow lawyerly precision seems to have eluded them completely. The entire process, this new compact, will only apply to, quote, large, unquote, movements of refugees. Not a very precise term, right? And it's not defined anywhere. So what is a large movement? 1,000 refugees? 10,000? 100,000? So Australia, for example, thought that when 300 people arrived, it was a mass influx. Tanzania barely blinked when 1.5 million arrived in 36 hours. Which standard are we going to apply? Secondly, even if we could somehow figure out what a large movement is, right? all of the ideas in the compact are just guideposts for a never-ending series of conversations. So when a large movement will happen, you want a dependable response. The UN will convene a meeting. And we'll invite states to come. And we'll ask them to help out. Woohoo, right? I feel vindicated now. If I were that poor country, if I were Tanzania with 1.5 million people coming over 36 hours, and I was told, hey guys, don't worry, just keep the doors open. We're going to get together and we'll probably help you, right? Which one of you would advise your client to sign that particular contract? And I'm hoping the answer is none of you. So we are going to have global refugee summits. We are going to have national steering groups. We are going to have solidarity conferences. We are going to have, get ready, global support platform meetings. We are going to have host country consultative. I'm not making this up. This is all in the compact. Unless the academics feel left out, there's regional consultations and, yes, a global academic network. Let's just co-opt everybody into a whole series of conversations that make us feel important. And sadly, the NGOs of the world have bought into this because they're all invited to the party. Academics weren't happy initially, but then we created a global academic network. I yesterday was shown an internal UNHCR memo that said there are only 3 loudmouths out there, including one in front of you, who are not willing to come on board with this. All right, that's where we're at right now. Why would UNHCR do that? Why would it propose, this is the UN Refugee Agency, right? Why would it propose such tepid, thin reforms when the problem is obviously so big and so critical to figure out? Why would you come up with thin when robust is obviously what's needed if you want to keep refugees alive and to treat states fairly? Now, UNHCR defends its approach on the grounds of realism. It says, look, these are tough times. Better to set up a voluntarist framework and get states talking about burden and responsibility sharing. Slow steps will eventually lead to someplace better. Hard thing to say to people like this, right? But I also think it's just not right. There is some scholarly support, though, for what UNHCR is doing. This is a quote from someone that might have a name you recognize. I know you all think of him as a political leader. The truth is, Michael Ignatieff, long before he was the head of the Liberal Party, was one of the greatest human rights scholars that my generation has produced. Right? He still, I think, is a brilliant writer. But Michael lately has come of the view that international human rights may actually not be so viable a concept. This is a bit scary for all of us who, like him, have worked in the field forever. And he says that we may not have enough of a consensus on what we want to do in order to attract people to actually do it anymore. And that does kind of play to the UNHCR's view. States just aren't sure yet that they want to actually create a global good for refugees. Perhaps even more frightening, in a recent article, Harlan Cohen has said that there's a life cycle to multilateralism, and that we may now have reached the point where there is no more success to be achieved. We have effectively created a multipolar world where powerful states are no longer in a position to twist the arms of others to come on board, as, for example, Western countries did with the Refugee Convention in the 1950s and 60s. So he says, look, we just may require much smaller deals. So you put these two ideas together. The consensus in favor of universal human rights is weak, and you may need smaller deals to keep people operating, and you can see some logic to where the UN Refugee Agency is coming from, if, I may say, you read it superficially. When you actually look down into what these scholars are saying, I think you end up in a different place. What is Michael Ignatieff really saying? He's saying the problem with the asylum system is that there's no upward limit to the number of people that a given country may need to receive, and that idea that a community could be effectively overwhelmed by outsiders is a threat to sovereignty. Now, I think there's actually some truth to what he's saying. Right? It is confronting to those of us steeped in the language of international human rights. I get that. But the idea that an obligation would be one-sided and absolute and take no account of the country to which refugees move is, I think, a real concern. Right? But if, as Ignatieff suggests, and I agree with him on this, that international norms should be nudging us, his language, toward a larger circle of moral concern, then what we need is action to diffuse the sense that asylum is inattentive, right? We need to address that problem. That is, I think, something we can and should do. It is not right. It is not right to do as we do today and say that accidents of geography mean that 60% of the world's refugees are in 10 countries, all of them poor. That is absurd. Not to be attentive to that reality, I think Ignatieff is right, is, I think, foolish. But the answer is not to go thin. The answer is to respond to that concern in an intelligent way. Similarly, when you look at what Cohen is suggesting, he's saying there have to be some real benefits at the local level if multilateralism is going to succeed. You have to show that it can deliver something to real people in real places. That's something I think we can and should take on. We have, for too long, ignored the needs of often very poor communities in states that receive refugees, and that is a mistake. We should be attentive to that. But again, that does not call for us to go thin. That calls for us to address the issue of the no upward limit, and it calls for us to actually make sure that there are reasonable benefits for people in the place to which refugees travel. The last thing we should be doing, if you follow the logic of these scholars, the last thing we should be doing is going thin and coming up with just a whole series of conversations that do nothing to respond to the inevitable pressure on states receiving refugees, much less to the sense of hosting communities that no one is caring about them. So what the UNHCR is proposing is, I think, conceptually wrong, and also, if I may be blunt, it is just stupid. It's an add-on. It's saying to governments, do everything you're doing now, and by the way, do this on top of it. Now, if you're a government minister, that's not very attractive, right? What we're not doing is harvesting any of the 25 billion Canadian dollars a year that we now spend on refugee status determination in rich countries for 10%. We're not harvesting that in a way that could fund a global regime because UNHCR says, keep all of your systems in place and do this other stuff as well. I think some trade-offs are needed and are ethical and warranted. So, putting it simply, if you want to respond to the dilemma, the best defense, I think, is a good offense. Make protection real, make it robust, make it reliable, not thin. Do not rely on accidents of geography to determine who's going to have the most refugees to look after, right? I mean, just 3 countries in the world are hosting virtually all of the Syrian refugees. Europe complains a lot, but it has virtually none of them, right? This system is not working. If you want to make it work, it needs to be robust, not thin. So, to quote a famous certain someone, right? You can. You just have to want to do it. You've got to make up your mind, make it happen. You do not want a program that reinvents the wheel each time. You do not want a never-ending talk shop. You want something that actually makes a difference in the lives of real people. So let me give you the outline of what I think that change would look like. This, by the way, is a Canadian-made solution. that was hammered out over 5 years by a consortium of more than 120 participants, including 6 governments, 3 wealthy countries and 3 poor countries. And it's a model that if you're interested in reading about it, we can give you the references later. It's complex and multi-layered as you would expect. Lawyers, social scientists, NGOs, intergovernmental organizations, all coming together over 5 years based at the Center for Refugee Studies at York University, and we came up with a model that we believe answers the challenge. So you know I'm going to give you the metaphor of a roadmap. It's tired but accurate, and I want you to see what a different system could look like, at least in brief. So first, and ironically, there is not one word in the UNHCR plan about what to me is the single most critical issue: access. Protection is no good if you can't get to it, right? Seems obvious. You could have a gorgeous courtroom, but if the doors to it are locked, who's getting justice, right? That is our fundamental problem. We now have rich countries doing everything they possibly can to slam doors on refugees. We have the European Union paying off the Libyan Coast Guard to grab refugees on the high seas, take them back to Libya, put them into detention indefinitely. We have Australia locking refugees up in Papua New Guinea and Nauru. We have the United States paying off Central American states and Mexico to keep the refugees for them. And lest you think Canada is benign on this, we have Canadian immigration officers training their counterparts in Russia and elsewhere about how to spot people who might be getting on airplanes in order to seek asylum here. So we are all working hard to avoid the arrival of refugees, much less the Canada-US refugee deal. I mean, good God. How can you on one and the same time say what Canada has rightly said about the Trump administration and then say any refugee will be fairly treated there, and by the way, you have no right to make a claim here if you happen to transit through the United States? That is garbage. That is just an unethical deal. But all rich countries are doing this in one way or another. So how do we get rid of that? You've got to enable refugees to get out and to get into a safe place by any way they can. Until they're out of a bad place, we don't have the power to help them. We don't have that degree of control. I actually think we can completely get rid of barriers to access if we do one simple thing. Right now, if you arrive physically at the airport in Winnipeg or Montreal or Vancouver, you are Canada's responsibility and Canada's responsibility only. No one else owes Canada anything. Putting it in much more crude terms, if you arrive in Kenya from Somalia, as millions have, you are 100% Kenya's responsibility. No one else owes you anything. If instead, when you arrived, you were not getting a right to stay in the place to which you have traveled, but you're getting access to the international system, which will then allocate a place of protection for you, then the idea of arriving at Pearson Airport becomes non-threatening. It has no immigration implications at all for Canada. The idea of arriving in Kenya is non-threatening. It's simply a place of transit in which the international agency will do, as it now does for the majority of refugees in the world, engage in status determination, largely group-based, very inexpensive, extremely efficient, and all of those who qualify as refugees get into the international system, but no domestic immigration consequence for the country to which they arrive. They're not going to be staying there. If you do that, there would be no reason to invest the billions of dollars every year to deter people, because you would get no negative from the arrival. Everyone arriving is coming through a gateway, not staying with you forever. Secondly, related to that, a process of assignment for protection based upon a formula that I'll describe in a moment. Quick and simple status assessment. We don't need a fancy process to, for example, figure out that a Syrian is a refugee. We assign refugees to a country that has signed the treaty and which honors it for what I call protection for duration of risk. And I am not shy about saying this will normally, in that first stage, be in the region of origin. The contributors to our study agreed that if what you want to do is to enable refugees quickly to get back on their feet, you are more likely to have functional and cultural compatibility closer to home. You are also more likely to enable refugees to test the waters for repatriation, which is in fact what most refugees want. The UN allocates the refugees using fairly sophisticated algorithms that teams of economists have now developed. They take state preferences and refugee preferences. I mean, thank God for the world of the algorithm. You can actually generate a reasonable, if not perfect, assignment mechanism that maximizes refugee preferences, although not bowing down to them. This is a protection regime. It's not an immigration regime. What you get is protection. And that is what this would eliminate. And by the way, what's really cool about this is that this would eliminate the illegitimate part of the smuggling market, because smugglers would now have no immigration result to sell. It would make no difference whether you arrive in Dorval or in Kenya, you go into the same system with the same opportunities. So smuggling is over. Third plank, empowerment. So refugees might be briefly detained in that first country of arrival while we vet their identity, assess their claim, ensure that they're not a security risk. The convention allows us to do that. Short term, not long term. But once they arrive in the country to which they've been assigned for protection, no constraints on freedom of movement, no constraints on the right to work or start businesses, no constraints on the ability to educate their children, precisely as the Refugee Convention that all of us have signed says we should do. All right? We allow refugees to get on with their lives. And what's really fascinating about this is we now have, for the first time, empirical data that shows that this really works. My colleague Alex Betts at Oxford ran a study for many years in Uganda, which we convinced to liberate most refugees from refugee camps and give them the rights to work. Once that happened, this is extraordinary actually, within 3 years, 21% of the urban refugees owned businesses that employed other people. And get ready for this one, 40% of the people employed in the refugee businesses were native Ugandans. When I was last in Tanzania about 8 months ago, the Ugandans were in town training the Tanzanians on how to do this. The Tanzanians were begging for this. Right? If you actually harness the potential of refugees, if you treat them like people with capacity rather than animals to cage up, the net result is overwhelmingly positive in terms of economic productivity. Fourth, we need to make asylum doable for the poorer countries of the world. The current system of forcing poor countries to come with a begging bowl each time they're faced with a major influx of refugees is both wrong and it's undignified. It's also stupid, because if you want to encourage a country to slam its doors shut, just tell it that you're not sure if you're going to help out, which is precisely what the UN Compact says. We'll hold a meeting, we'll talk about it. Well, duh, what do I do right now, right? What would you do if you had 1.5 million people arriving at your border and you were desperately poor? If you had the means, you'd slam the door. It amazes me that more poor countries don't do that. Right? I mean, there's the irony. The world's poorest country is doing almost all the work while we complain about it. So if you want to make this doable, right, we guarantee the funds that those states require to receive, house, and integrate the refugees when they arrive. That comes out of guaranteed international funds. Beyond that, we create international startup grants. And this has been shown to be a brilliant idea in several countries in Africa now, where we link refugees to the host communities. This is Harlan Cohen's critical point. Show real benefit to the host community. When refugees are linked to the host community in joint development projects, both win. I was working in Nepal on a project where Bhutanese refugees were integrated in major agricultural enterprises with the local Nepalese. That group of Nepalese are huge fans of refugee protection because they've seen the arrival of refugees to be something that actually engendered progress for them as well as for the refugees. It can be a win-win. Now here's the really freaky part. Everything I've just described, having a process of international status assessment, we don't need, the Canadian Refugee Board, the American Board of, sorry, all of you who want to do, you're all out of a job now, right? We don't need to spend $25 billion a year on that. Everything that I've just described, receiving the refugees, processing their claims, moving them to a place of protection, enabling that country to meet their needs, and the local development grants. The economists in our study said that all of that could be done for less money than we now spend to process the claims of the 10% in rich countries. No new money needed to run the system. Finally, and most importantly, we've got to have a solution to refugeehood. I mean, this idea that we've got 12 million people who've been waiting on average 20 years in a hellhole of an urban slum or a camp ought to appall everybody in this room. Can you imagine your life? Just think about that for a moment. You were born in a camp, your children will be born in that camp, and you will probably die in that camp. Do you think you might be radicalized in that environment? I sure as hell would be. You want to create angry people? Treat them like animals. The system we've got makes no sense. On average today, about a quarter of refugees can and do go home within 5 years of arrival. 5 years, by the way, is a magic number for us. The social psychologists on our team said that up to 5 years, so long as refugees are treated with dignity and their rights respected, there's no irreversible psychosocial harm. There will be exceptions, trauma victims, torture victims who need an immediate remedy. But the majority, as long as people have a dignified reception, which is what I'm proposing, up to 5 years, there's no irreversible psychosocial harm from the lack of a permanent solution. So you build that into the system so that a quarter of them don't need a new home. They actually, most refugees will tell you that what they want ideally is to be able to go home. Syrians in particular did not want to leave their country, right? That was a horrible decision for virtually all of them. If it were safe and durably safe to go back, they will. Similarly, if you actually do what I'm describing with the joint development projects and you're actually liberating refugees to be productive, the number who will be offered local settlement goes way up. The US State Department, for example, found exactly that. In 2014, they showed that when Cameroon, Tanzania, and Zambia had done what I described, the number offered permanent local integration went up dramatically. Probably another quarter of the refugee population if we do it right. But you can do the math. If a quarter go home and a quarter can be integrated where they are, that still leaves half what are today that protracted refugee population, kept on the margins with no chance to go anywhere. Under my model, at that 5-year point, when the risk of psychosocial harm becomes real, every single refugee is guaranteed a right to be permanently resettled to another country. That will be the primary job of protection of countries like Canada that are farther away from refugee flows. Australia, New Zealand, Europe, the Americas, we're farther away from the flows. We can do this job, which, by the way, countries in Africa in particular have a real hard time with. South Africa is the only country that has historically offered permanent residency to refugees. It's just not something they've been able to cope with, but understandably, given the massive numbers they've received on an emergency basis. So it's what environmental lawyers call common but differentiated responsibility. We all have a job to do, but we contribute in different ways. You can't buy your way out of protection. This is not dollars instead of people. You do both. But the people side that makes sense for countries farther from refugee flows is, I think, to provide a permanent home to those who cannot go home after 5 years, the ones that we've ignored right now. Now, here's where it becomes seriously interesting. A year ago, I didn't have these numbers, but the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the club of rich countries, if you will, has just released numbers that showed that there were last year 1.65 million asylum applicants in rich countries. Under the model that I've described, we need 1.7 million resettlement places each year. Virtually the exact same number. So what we do is we swap out asylum applicants for permanently resettled people. Rich countries would be taking significant numbers of refugees, but in a different stage of their journey. A stage, by the way, again, that is almost completely ignored right now. The US, Australia, and Canada are the only countries that make a significant contribution, and there again, the total is only 100,000 places out of the 12 million who need them. So I think that's where we go. So question, right? Could we do this? Hopefully some of you are asking that question. And of course, in line with the Obama metaphor, right? Yes, we can. I'm going to tell you we can. I began life in law doing history. And so I believe learning the lessons of history is important if you want to understand where the future might take us. So for example, the very first refugee arrangements were almost exactly at the 100-year point. 1920 is the first refugee arrangement. Under the early generations of refugee treaties, we did not have every country with its own little bureaucracy processing refugee claims and arguing in courts. And we had one international entity, then called the Nansen Office, that assessed status, issued a Nansen passport, and states simply agreed to recognize it. Cheap, efficient, simple, and it worked. The Cold War got in the way because people wanted to use refugees for strategic reasons. That's long gone. Nobody is seeking refugees today for strategic reasons. So we could move back to the more efficient, simple system that I've described. After the Second World War, we had an organization called the International Refugee Organization that had its own fleet of ships. It literally moved more than 1 million refugees out of Europe to Africa, Latin America, North America, Oceania. If we could do that in 1950, for God's sake, right? We can certainly do it today with much more inexpensive, easy transcontinental travel. It's not that complex to move refugees to their new homes. What about the interstate cooperation part? Different states doing different jobs. Well, in the 1970s, we did that as well. There was something called the Comprehensive Plan of Action for Indo-Chinese refugees. Refugees then fleeing Vietnam, ending up in Malaysia, Hong Kong, and other states that simply couldn't handle them all. What did we do? We got together and we said, you guys let them in for processing, we'll give them permanent homes. Canada and others stepped forward, and it worked. It was replicated in Africa and in Latin America. Managed protection systems work. And yeah, you knew I had to give you this one, right? Come on, we've got a hunky prime minister. You have to kind of brag about it once in a while. What about this idea of doing a whole lot more resettlement than what we're doing now? Could we actually do it? I remember talking to the woman who ended up being in charge of the Canadian, ramped up process of resettlement for the Syrian refugees. And she said, when the order came down from the PCO that we should do this, everybody in the immigration department was completely freaked out. The idea that Canada would resettle 3 to 4 times as many refugees in 3 months as it normally does in a year was just impossible. And then she said, but we came up with a mechanism. She said, instead of doing step 1, then step 2, then step 3, then step 4, then step 5, we did 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 simultaneously. And we were able to process all of those claims without losing anything on security vetting in a much more speed. And they nearly hit the target of 25,000, as you all know, in that time frame. We can do it. We did it. We did it. So I think we not only can do this, but should do it. Here's the critical point. And I'm a lapsed Catholic, so I do everything in threes. This is Jesuitical training never leaves you. This is a better deal for refugees, for poor countries, and for rich countries. So for refugees, why would this be a better deal? It's a better deal for refugees because, number one, they would not have to put their lives on the line to get access to solid protection. You would not need to get on that horrible crowded boat in order to save your life. Number two, protection would really be the empowering rights regarding protection that the Refugee Convention actually commits us to. Rights to work, education, setting up businesses, all of that. Number three, and most important, every refugee is guaranteed a solution by the 5-year mark. No more protracted refugee situations. No more 3 generations behind barbed wire. I think it's also a better proposition for the Global South that now hosts 90% of the world's refugees. First of all, they would no longer have to beg for charity from wealthy countries, but they would be guaranteed the funds they need to protect refugees. Secondly, not only would they get the funds to protect refugees, but as I've described, they would get the economic startup grants that would link refugees to host communities and promote their own economic development. And third, they would not face the perverse penalty which they now face of if you keep your doors open to refugees, as we say you should, you are stuck with them forever. Because at the 5-year mark, those who aren't locally integrated or who can't go home would be guaranteed resettlement elsewhere. That's a much better system for those states. And what about for us? It's also better for us. Number one, the assignment mechanism that I've talked about would completely undermine the smuggling market and reduce the use of the refugee channel for economic migration. Arriving in Toronto would not get you Canada. So there would be no logic to smuggling under that system. Secondly, rich countries would get the thing that they have been demanding, which is plenty of time to vet their security concerns about those they might ultimately admit. During that 5-year process that they are elsewhere, there is a long time lag within which to do that vetting. And third, the focus on protection by resettlement is, quite frankly, I think, a better social fit for us than is temporary presence. Rich countries tend to want to integrate in ways that isn't always true in the less developed world. We are good at it. Countries like Canada are settler states. They are, by definition, able to receive, incorporate, and embrace. Why not play to that strength? Common but differentiated responsibility. So my point, though, is that this is not that this is a slam dunk easy option, but anything worthwhile never is. If you haven't learned that yet, you will soon. There are some challenges. I'm just going to quickly, in 5 minutes, name the challenge before I open the room to you. I want you to know that I've thought about them. Number one, what would that formula look like that would distribute burdens, money, and responsibilities to people? There's a lot of work that's already been done out there. Oxfam, in particular, has come up with an amazing set of formula based on the Human Development Index, GDP, the Fragile State Index. They've come up with actual numbers and published them for what fair shares would look like. So there are models out there with which to begin. Secondly, you'd need a strong central actor to run this. But who would that be? Could it be UNHCR? Could it be retooled? Well, Alex Betts says no. He says they are, quote, not currently equipped, unquote, to manage a refugee system. That's a little harsh, I think. For all of my critiques, I think that they could see the light. I mean, not to get too deeply into this, but right now they are being squeezed out in the UN system. The High Commissioner for Human Rights is out there arguing for refugee rights. She's the one that's now investigating the detention of refugees in Libya, not UNHCR, right? And who's handling refugee assistance? Not UNHCR anymore, the International Organization for Migration that has now become part of the UN family. UNHCR needs a role if it wants to survive. So even if you are a crass institutional actor, You should be thinking of, which I kind of think they are. But you know, I mean, we're all crass when it comes to self-interest, right? I mean, I get that. I think if you gave them a real role that was not thin, but robust, it would be a smart institutional move for them. They have the capacity to do this. And again, their predecessors did this in years gone by. Third, and perhaps most significantly, we need political leadership for it to happen. This has been the biggest problem. We do have some heroes out there, right? Our own Justin Trudeau, Angela Merkel in Germany, King Abdullah in Jordan, Jakaya Kikwete in Tanzania. There have been some extraordinary statespeople out there that have stood up for refugees. There is right now a process funded by Canada, a global refugee council, co-chaired by Canada, Germany, Pakistan, and Tanzania, with former leaders from those countries running it. It thus far has failed to deliver. It's been a talk shop. Could we light a fire under that process? Wouldn't a quadrumvirate of Merkel, Trudeau, Abdullah, and Kikwete, and perhaps others coming along, be what we actually need to mobilize the world? I think we could play that role in this country. Beyond those practical questions, there is a key ethical question that I'm going to put on the table because one of you is going to skewer me with it if I don't, right? And I get it, that some of you are probably thinking, but doesn't this take away refugee freedom of choice? And at some level it does, right? But freedom of choice is not an absolute right. This is a protection system. This is not a migration system, right? It's like if you need to go to the emergency room and one is full, you may have to go to a different one. That's life. You need your life to be saved. You don't always get to go to the emergency room in the hospital of your choice, but you are entitled to an emergency room that works and delivers the care that you need and are entitled to. So, at the risk of sounding overly utilitarian, but I don't actually mind the utilitarian label, the equal moral worth of every refugee matters to me, not just of the 10% who get to rich countries. If we sacrifice a little bit of the freedom of the tiny minority, disproportionately young, male, and mobile, who get to rich countries, so that the other 90% get something fair and decent, my view is that is not only ethically proper, but ethically compelled. And I don't shy away from that. But you don't need to entirely eradicate refugee freedom of choice. As I said, the algorithm methods will enable us to inject some measure, although not absolute choice, some measure of choice into the system. But I think we ought not to reify choice at the cost that we now pay, which is, again, 12 million people with nothing, and the majority of refugees in states that cannot afford to look after them. So I want you to engage with me. I will ask you to remember the Voltaire's admonition that the perfect is the enemy of the good. The question is, could we do better than we do now? I think you have to put it that way. I want you, though, as you look at it and to think about it, that what's on offer now from UNHCR does not eliminate barriers to access. It doesn't assign refugees to a place of protection. It doesn't ensure protection. It doesn't require burden or responsibility sharing, and much less does it guarantee a solution for those who can't go home. Putting it bluntly, if a bit crudely, the operational mechanism for their global compact is now called the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, the CRRF. I think it's actually a contingent refugee assistance project, and not just because the acronym seems to sort of sum it all up. Sadly, this is a plan that will do a lot more to keep UNHCR and international bureaucrats in business than it will to help refugees. So my urgent plea to you is to call out this so-called compact for what it really is, which is a cop-out on refugees. And most fundamentally of all, to deliver to the world at large, and specifically to the Canadian government, which has taken a role in sponsoring this Global Refugee Council, that this incrementalist, thin veneer of reform is not good enough. That it's time for a reform that puts all refugees wherever they are located, whether we see them or we don't, at first and foremost in our line of sight, and which recognizes that if you want to keep multilateralism alive, you need a robust reform, not a cautious reform. So what I'm asking you to do is to think about these principles, think about what could be done, and at the end of the day, to speak truth to power and not to settle for a thin semblance of what's really needed. Thanks very much.